Let's throw that open to the different speakers, Andreas. Thank you very much for your contribution. You've led us very neatly into questions. So perhaps if we just throw that open to everybody, I mean, how would you summarize the evidence that living on these social frontiers does have negative impacts? I know some of you are deeper into the research than others, but Gwilym, perhaps you could just give us the headlines on what the evidence is of that negative impact.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what's really surprising is how little work has been done on the impacts of social frontiers. People have looked at segregation of various sorts. Thousands of papers that do that. Very few look at the existence of social frontiers, and even fewer look at the impact on life outcomes, on mental health, etc. So when we were writing this bid and we've done various literature reviews, we only really came across 4 or 5 papers that looked at impacts. One was the Northern Ireland study, which I mentioned, which looked at the impact of peace walls on the take-up of antidepressant and anti-anxiety drugs, and the effects that were really, really big. Basically, it increased the take-up of antidepressants by nearly 40%, anti-anxiety drugs by nearly 40%, and I think antidepressants by the increase was 20%. In our research, we found that social frontiers in Sheffield were associated with an increase in crime, and similar studies that have been done in the States, in New York and elsewhere. All of those studies, I think, are not proving causation. They're not even really using methods that test for causation, so it's really an association. So there are lots of questions that some of you have raised about how do we know what the causal mechanism is between social frontiers and the impacts on crime. We have some theories and ideas, but where are the crimes being committed? Are they being committed by people on one side of the frontier against those on the other side of the frontier? And same with mental health. Are we following individuals over time to look at those causal effects? We're not going to be able to address all those things here because there's a massive opportunity here for a lifetime of studying social frontiers. What I would say is that one of the great advantages of bringing in colleagues from Sweden and Norway is their amazing data sets that might allow us to follow people over time. Those data sets follow the whole population essentially over time, and do some more rigorous work in this area.
And you're going to be doing, is it fair to say, quite in-depth interviews with people living on these frontiers, so that you might be able to dig into whether mental health problems are just a correlation, because many of these people will have been fleeing conflict zones, may have come from countries with natural disasters. So you'll be digging into whether that's a correlation or whether there is an actual impact of, or whether there's a causal factor.
Yeah, I mean, actually what you've raised there is an important aspect of our research, or planned research, that it's mixed methods, because we can follow people using quantitative data sets over time, but we also want to go and talk to them, just as you said, and to actually ask them, well, what's going on here? What do you feel is the driver behind your mental health problems, or the increasing crime near the social frontier? Is it about the conflict between these two communities, or is it because of something completely different? So that's right. Hopefully the combination of talking to people and also using statistical measures will hopefully get us a better grasp on the role of social frontiers, if indeed they do have an effect on people's lives.
There's a great question from Heather Rolfe, who asks, is the concept of social frontiers relevant to the situation where workplaces have become very segregated, including predominantly migrant workers? I'm thinking as a journalist of the recent story about lots of migrant workers from India in the factories in Leicester, working in very poor conditions. Heather says, could that be a useful frontier to look at as well? What's everyone's thoughts on that?
Well, Heather, I think your question actually raises or points to one of the very first uses of the word social frontier, albeit it was in a way a slightly different way to how we're applying it, and it was applied in employment studies to describe these kind of social divisions that can occur within an organisation. We're defining it in a very spatial way, in a territorial way. So we're saying where there's a clear territorial demarcation between two groups, and I guess that could conceivably happen in a workplace, but I'm not sure how that might work. What I am very interested in, though, and I hope we will be able to do some work on this, is to see whether firms either side of the frontier, whether the makeup of their employees reflects which side of the frontier they're on. And I think, I wonder if Urban, you might say something here about the Swedish data that might allow us to do that. I think we've had some conversations about that. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, I think this is a very good question. In this data that I described in my talk, there's a lot of information about the labor market and where people work and what kind of positions they have and where the workplaces are located. So actually we could see, I mean, so far we have talked about kind of a residential landscape where people live, but we could also talk about a kind of work landscape or a workplace landscape where these workplaces are located, who is working there, what kind of position do you have in this workplace, and so on. So that will be very much possible to do. And you can look at this in a more longitudinal way and see how it changes over time. So that's absolutely an option.
There's another question from Veronica, who asked the whole research team, are you planning to introduce measurements of internal migrants? So, for example, people who've come from a rural background or, from another town or city in a country. And are you considering comparing that to foreign-born social mobility? So comparing indigenous, if you like, social mobility with foreign-born social mobility.
Well, I know in the UK, I understand that there is just very recently being done a project, I think it might be by the Social Mobility Commission, looking at the impact of internal migration on social mobility. I would need to verify that. But if that's the case, then our work would really nicely complement that, because we'd be able to compare our social mobility estimates of different groups, including migrants and non-migrants, with the existing work that's been done. I should, just as a general point though, we are not just looking at the social mobility of migrants versus non-migrants. We want to look at how fragmented social mobility is amongst different groups in the UK and Sweden and Norway. Which groups we can look at will partly depend on the data and on the time available we have in the project. I don't know if Liv and Urban want to chip in anything there.
I think that's. I mean, if you're going to look into internal migration, then we will think about it in terms of urbanization processes and population redistribution within the country. And as far as I've been thinking right now, it's a kind of another study, but it could also be done with this kind of data.
Yeah. And Liv, you mentioned in your presentation the importance of education for integration, and you talked about different educational outcomes between boys and girls from immigrant families. I know you're quite early into your research, but are you expecting to see that the effect of living close to a social frontier might also differ by gender?
We don't know if these frontiers exist in Norway, but I expect that, yes, it seems as if boys are the most vulnerable group. So my expectations are, and my answer to that question is yes, I think so.
And Urban, you go on, sorry.
I was just going to say that on that question, for me, the issue is the territoriality associated with social frontiers a gender-specific thing? And it might well be that, for example, if you've been involved in gangs as a young male, it might well be that those territorial boundaries are much more significant for you than they might be for your female counterparts. So that's just a hypothesis. There's been no research done on that, as far as I'm aware, in the UK. But a really interesting question.
Okay. And Urban, you stress the importance of long-term perspectives on integration. Do you think that the effect of social frontiers could be more important for some age groups or life stages than others? So as well as maybe a gender difference, could there be a life stage difference?
I think I would like to think about social frontiers and in terms of life course perspective. I mean, you could be living there as a young person, and then you move somewhere else, and things happen to your life in terms of career and all these things, and try to figure out to what extent what happened in the past in your life has something to do with that. So actually, if you think about it in a kind of life course perspective, we could observe people in different stages of life. It could be young people, it could be in middle age, and also elderly people. So it opens up for many different types of studies, I guess.
And do any of the areas that you're looking at have any interventions to deal with social frontiers, or if they're not described as social frontiers, sort of people are often aware of them even if they're not labelled as social frontiers? I'm thinking, you spoke, Gwilym, about those very visible social frontiers in Belfast. There are schools, integrated schools, that have been deliberately built on those peace lines. Do any of the areas that you're studying have those kinds of interventions? I'm thinking of places like Oldham, where schools were reconfigured after the riots there that came about through community tensions. And do you have any thoughts about whether those kinds of interventions can mitigate the effects of social frontiers?
I think that, again, another really good question. I know that, as you say, in Belfast, there have been attempts to integrate groups, to increase contact and encourage non-denominational schools, etc. And there is a body of work on that, specifically in the Northern Ireland context, which I think does show that positive contact over a prolonged period between groups does help break down barriers. And in some ways, that's one of the assumptions underneath our work that we kind of want to test. In terms of other areas, well, we don't know where the social frontiers are. If you live near one, you almost certainly do. But in terms of us as researchers just simply looking at the data, our first step is to try and identify them using hopefully robust statistical measures to do that. Once we identify them, we can then zoom in at least on some of them and say, what's going on here? Are there interventions that have taken place? And we also want to go and talk to people at those areas. I should also put out a call to people, if you know social frontiers, either where you live now or where you grew up in the UK, Sweden or Norway, please let us know, because we would really love to know where you know they exist and how well our algorithm works at picking those up. So please do let us know, and please also let us know if you're involved in any interventions to bring people together either side of a frontier.
Do you think that now, many of us, I know the picture may be different in Sweden and Norway, but many of us are living much more locally. Do you think that is going to make some of these social frontiers more visible, more noticeable than they perhaps used to be?
As a result of COVID, do you mean?
Yeah, I just mean that previously, neighbours would have been travelling into work every day, coming home in the evening. They might have had less contact with people in their neighbourhood than they perhaps are now. Our worlds have shrunk a little bit. Do you think that's going to make the way that these social frontiers operate, and also how visible, noticeable they are, a little bit different?
I've been pondering something similar in my own kind of lockdown, going out for my daily walks and thinking I'm kind of in this mini world of walking around what is my neighborhood. And yeah, I do wonder if that will reinforce these inter-neighborhood intra-neighbourhood connections, and may also make the existence of social frontiers more problematic for people living near them, if it means that they're curtailed essentially in terms of where they can walk, where they can go, and it might well increase their sense of territoriality. So that's a really nice hypothesis. We're going to call that the Helen Grady hypothesis.
I'm just thinking that you really notice when you are not going into a city centre or a town centre, you can suddenly notice, oh, I live in a very white area, or oh, I live in a very, whatever kind of area it is. It becomes a little bit more noticeable. Just before we wrap up, because we're running out of time, a question from Hannah to Gwilym. How exactly are you planning to identify and define these social frontiers? And how are you mitigating the risk of stereotyping or stigmatizing particular areas? People might not be pleased to discover that they live on a social frontier or to have it named as such.
There's two questions there. I'll take the second one first. Is if we reveal where social frontiers are, is that going to be problematic? And there's a very similar discussion that took place regarding deprivation indices. Some people feel very upset that their neighbourhood is labelled a highly deprived area in the published government indices of deprivation. And I guess as a team, we need to think through whether we make these social frontiers public, and I think we'll do that. Won't decide that ourselves. We'll take advice and talk to people on the ground and talk to people who've been involved in deprivation index work, for example. I'm open to both arguments. I don't have a strong view in it, and I do understand the concerns. It might be that we only release the data to other researchers, for example, and not make it public. Having said that, if you live near a social frontier, you probably know about it. At local level, people tend to know where these things are. In terms of how we will estimate them, in one way, it's very simple. What we're trying to do, we're saying where the percentage difference in, for example, the people that are poor versus non-poor in two neighbourhoods is very different, where there's a step change. We're interested in these step changes in multiple dimensions: ethnicity, religion, age, and social class. In terms of the technical issues that come with that, the reason why it's a bit more complicated than just calculating percentages is that you can get a big step change just by random chance, if you like. And so what we have tried to develop are measures that test whether what that social frontier we're observing is not due to chance, but is actually something genuine. But we're constantly trying to find ways to improve those methods, and so in future presentations we'll be presenting some of the methodological innovations and challenges that we face. But really good and important question, that. And
one very final one to sneak in from Bertha, who just asks, when you are identifying social frontiers, do you expect them to be dynamic or static?
Well, I think, to put it another way, if you live near a social frontier over a prolonged period, then it's more likely to have a big effect. So if the social frontier is dynamic, it's not constant, or if you're dynamic, if you're moving around, you're only exposed to it for a short period, then the impacts are going to be less. So what we'll observe, I think, is various sorts of social frontiers, some of them very dynamic, some very, very entrenched, like in Northern Ireland. Our hypothesis is that if you live for a prolonged period near a very entrenched, very steep social frontier, then the effect is likely to be greater.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers, Professor Gwilym Pryce, Professor Liv Osland, Professor Urban Lindgren, to the Right Honourable Professor, the Lord David Blunkett, to Glenny Jelstad and Andreas Sandberg. Thank you to everybody. Also to Annetta, who kept us on air and has been posting links to everything that we've mentioned. And I'm sure this is a discussion that will continue. Thanks, everybody. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. And a big thank you to you, Helen, for doing such a great job of hosting and coming up with a new hypothesis.
Thanks. I think that's one for another documentary. Definitely. I'll write the pitch now. Thanks a lot.
Great.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye for now.